fuels. We did contact the Washington Post for a response, but we didn't actually hear back from them. Now, folks, it's time to pop into our virtual classroom. Our politicians struggle to define what a woman is, apparently, and there have been plenty of stories in this week about trans women athletes. So today we're going to get to the bottom of it. What is a woman? I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Lord Robert Winston, Professor of Science and Society at Imperial College London and Professor of Fertility Studies as well. Hello there. What is a woman then? How do we actually define a woman? Apparently a lot of politicians are struggling with this now.
Well, I don't think defining anybody is quite the right question to ask. I think what we need to ask is, what is the fundamental difference between men and women, or between boys and girls, or between the two sexes? And there are fundamental differences which are quite clear. With regard to being I think there's a confusion here between one's sex and one's gender. And of course, there is gender reassignment. It's possible to have organs removed and other mutilations, including, for example, giving drugs which might change the way you feel and how your body behaves. But that's not the same as changing your sex. You can't change your sex because your sex is defined in quite a different way. There are 5 ways we can define sex. One, of course, is basically how we look. For example, having sex organs like a breasts, a penis, a uterus, and so on. That's one 5. But that, of course, can be changed because you can actually remove breasts, you can remove a uterus, you can actually change the morphology, the shape of the human body by doing that. But of course, it is a form of mutilation in doing that. You can also, in fact,
on that point then about being able to recognise those differences just by using your eyes, it's something that I think we've done throughout the ages. On the issue about that's widely covered in the press about the participation of trans women or biological men in women's sports, what are the physical elements that are going through puberty as a biological male actually mean that you have a biological advantage over women in certain sports?
Well, that comes to that's another definition of sex. Basically, the key definition of sex is your genetic sex. Basically, every single cell in your body is created by genes and is controlled by genes. So, for example, you have about 7 or 8 trillion cells in your body. And if you're a woman, you have 2 X chromosomes with the female carrying characteristics. And if you are a male or a boy, you have a Y chromosome, which carries about 40 genes, all of which dictate your sex. Now, you cannot change that by simply operating on somebody or giving them hormones because you still have the Y chromosome. And so the risks in regard to sport is that somebody who has male characteristics will have been at some stage from the time they were in uterus onwards associated with hormones which in fact are gradually developing their musculature and other things which will clearly give them an advantage over a woman. Now, even if you change the body after puberty, or in some cases even before puberty, the fact is it is probable that you will have different characteristics as a result of that. Now, the issue, of course, is that nobody's ever done any proper research just to see how this is. And one of the difficulties is because the whole issue of transgender is so complex and is so much criticized. As soon as you come on the media and mention that you believe the things that I'm saying are biologically true, are scientifically certain, you come under immense criticism. So doctors and physiologists and people like myself tend not to put their head above the parapet. But actually, that's one of the reasons.
Yes, and that is truly damaging, I think, for debate and speech. I mean, you standing up in the House of Lords, in the upper chamber, and saying that actually it was part of the maternity bill on when the Attorney General would have had to resign in order to actually go on maternity leave. And part of this bill said pregnant people, if I've got that right, instead of course, women, right. Because I cannot get pregnant, for example, as you well know. So I want to just ask about that bill in particular. Why do you think there has been this increase in this changing of language and words accepted for many, many years in this country?
I think there is pressure from the transgender community, which is understandable. I have nothing against transgender people. They're perfectly welcome, as far as I'm concerned, to either dress like a female or a male. That's entirely up to them. But there are certain things which they can't change. And one of the things you can't change is to actually have a baby. It's not possible for a male to have a baby. In fact, nobody's ever managed to do this, although there have been many people who've changed their sex from female to male, for example, who've subsequently, in fact, as a fertility surgeon, asked me if I would try and help them have a baby. So I've had requests for males to have babies. The only way you could do that would be by implanting an embryo directly into the abdomen, where, of course, it would grow rather like a tumour and would risk the life of the individual, which is why, of course, nobody has done that. Even transplanting a uterus, which is technically just possible, you might be able to eventually have somebody who is pregnant who's a male, but the risk to that person would be so great that no surgeon, no doctor would contemplate it. The other problem, of course, is this, that if transgender is a normal procedure, then the real question is, does the NHS be expected to pay for this? Because if people, in fact, have a problem with their sex, to what extent is this an illness, or is it just a condition that they want to change? And the NHS, under pressure as it is, may decide, of course, that these are things that it shouldn't be accomplishing. And at the moment, the NHS is also in a tangle with how they should handle people who are transgender, what sort of ward they should be in, and whether or not, of course, they should have the sort of hormones. Now, at the moment, an indication has gone out to GPs that they are allowed to give the hormones to change somebody's hormonal state at puberty. My own view, I think this is quite dangerous, but it is something which is accepted in some quarters. But of course, that is a cost to the NHS.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, it is. And Robert, I wonder if you've had any reflections, and just briefly there, because we are coming to the end of the show, I regret to say, why do you think there have been massive increases? I left school in 2009. If you look at the percentage of the increase in the number of children who say they are experiencing gender dysphoria, there can't all of a sudden just be a massive number of more people experiencing it, can there?
We've always had that. I don't doubt that you, certainly I, most normal males and normal females at some time question their genitals and are worried that they're not quite right. It's very, very common. And before puberty, of course, there is considerable confusion about one's sex. At a time when those hormones are developing and one's changing into an adult, it is a massive time of considerable concern for everybody. It's quite usual. And of course, the risk is that you can confuse that concern into some status which it perhaps isn't. What I would want to say finally is I've seen so many people in my practice as a fertility specialist who desperately wanted a baby after a sex change and found to their horror that wasn't possible. And that's caused them immense distress and depression, and some have even tried to commit suicide. So I think it's a very, very serious issue.
Yes, and I think we aren't talking about the risks and harms potentially posed by medical intervention enough. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think that's one of the risks, but I think also, of course, what we've got to in a situation now is political correctness about the nature of gender. And I think that that's not very satisfactory, because political correctness does not, in fact, get to the real truth of the issues.
Well, indeed. And Lord Robert Winston, thank you so much for shining some insight into that very thorny, it has to be said, issue. Professor of Science and Society at Imperial College London there. Thank you very much for watching Real Britain with me, Darren Grimes.